Understanding the difference between these two can save you a lot of time and a lot of energy. Most films at the independent level are financed by a combination of both of these things, debt and equity. And the really good, smart producers out there, the ones that know how to access both of these and know how to bring them together, merge them together to create an optimal finance plan. Hi everyone, my name's Alexi Uzas. For those of you who don't know who I am a film producer based in Australia, and I run a company called Exile Entertainment. We produce feature films and I make these videos to help everyone on their filmmaking journey. So let's dive into it. Let's start with explaining what debt is, then we'll go through what equity is. We're going to make those specific to the film industry, so we won't be talking about those broadly. We'll be very specific to the industry. And then I'm going to talk to you about where does creative input come into this, because that's something that you might be worried about as a filmmaker. If you're going to go out, borrow money or raise money, how does that affect the creative? And then we'll talk about how you can use both of these to really kind of form the best finance plan possible. So let's start with debt finance. So debt finance is essentially when you borrow money, right? You're borrowing money from a lender and you're then using that money and then you're going to repay that money back at a later date. And so in the film industry, typically you're borrowing against either a tax incentive, a distribution advance, or pre-sales. So it's those three that you're borrowing against. And let's start with a tax incentive and then I'll take you through the other two. So if you access a tax incentive, you're not going to get the money from that film commission until right at the end of the project. That's when they give you the actual cash for that project. And so you as a producer need that money, you need that cash to be able to spend that money to pay vendors, to pay crew, to actually make the film. So the way that you get that cash is you go and borrow it. And you usually borrow it from a film finance company, but you can borrow it from anyone. Right? You could go and find a private individual that lends that money to you. And the reason we would go with a finance company, a film finance company over a private individual is because it's an area, film finance is an area that not everyone understands. And so it's much quicker and easier to go with a film finance company because they know, they're familiar with this type of lending. So that's really the reason why you would, but you could go with a private investor and probably get a better rate from them. So if you're borrowing against a tax incentive and you're getting that cash up front, then what's really important to understand is that that money isn't secured against any of your personal property. So it's not like you're having to borrow this money and put up your home as collateral or security in order to secure that loan. These film finance companies will lend you that money. They'll lend it against the tax incentive. They will take security over the film. And if you have a holding company, so if you have a company that owns your IP, they won't take security over all of the assets of the company. It will be a specific security. And so in that way, the risk to you is very limited. So if you're borrowing against a tax incentive, there's really very little personal risk to you. Now, there are some exceptions to this. If you're going and borrowing money in a country that, perhaps they've just set up a rebate, potentially there's been like financial issues in that country. Maybe there's not that many finance companies that are operating in that company yet. They might ask you for a personal guarantee. It can happen. But typically, if you're in Australia, the US, Canada, UK, most European countries, like if there's a tax incentive and there are film finance companies that are lending against that, they won't and shouldn't ask for a personal guarantee. So there's a big onus then on the lender to really get his lending right? Because there's very little recourse to them in terms of real assets. So there is a period of due diligence that they will undertake. They'll want to look at your finance plan, your budget. They'll speak to people, probably without you even knowing. They'll want to know who your lawyers are, your accountants are. They'll do some digging in the industry and really make sure that they are confident that you are going to be able to pull off this project, because the worst thing that could happen is that you start this project, for whatever reason you can't finish it, and then you haven't spent the money that you've borrowed, and so the tax incentive that you get back is going to be smaller than what you borrowed against. So there is a real risk there to the lender, and so for that reason they do need and want to get comfortable with who they're lending to. And so also the more that you do this, the more that you make films, the more comfortable the lender becomes, and the more you can develop that relationship and kind of streamline the process. That's certainly something that I've found. So when you're borrowing against a tax incentive, a film finance company will typically lend you 90% of what you're expecting to get back, and they will borrow at interest rates of around 7 to 8%. Typically, there'll be a 2 to 3% setup fee, and then there'll be legal costs on top of that. So as a general kind of rule of thumb, you're paying around 10% of the 90% of the tax incentive that you're expecting to get back. So your finance costs are 10% of that money that you're expecting to get back. So 10% of the 90%. So that's how the tax incentives work. Now, if you have a sales agent or distributor who's agreed to put up some money against the film, then the finance company can also lend against that, because the distributor or the sales agent, they're not going to pay you until the end as well, right? They're going to wait until the film's delivered, and that's where they're going to pay you. Now, typically, if you're signing on with a sales agent or distributor, they will pay something on signing, usually around 10 to 20% upfront, and then the rest gets paid on delivery. So again, as a producer, if you need that cash for the production, you will borrow that money. And typically a finance company will lend 80% of that advance, and again at around 10% when you include the interest, the setup fees, and legals. So what's important to know with sales agents and distributors is, again, film finance companies, they will do their due diligence on who those companies are. So they know better than anyone which of those sales agents are reputable, which of them pay on time and don't pay on time. And so if there's any risk, they're simply not going to lend against that advance, right? So that's something that you need to keep in mind when you're going out and you're securing these deals, is that you want to be working with companies that are reputable, because a lender just isn't going to lend against someone that they know doesn't pay or doesn't pay on time, because that's the risk to them, because again, they're not taking any security over your personal assets. So that debt will it's called senior debt. And so what they typically do get is they get an entitlement to any distribution revenue that comes in to cover any shortfall in their loan. So if there is a shortfall for whatever reason, like a sales agent not paying, or maybe you don't get as much back from the tax incentive that you thought, two things. Number one, that's why they are lending you less than the 100%. They're creating a little buffer of error there, a safety of margin, and margin of safety. And then if that comes back less and they're owed a bit of money, then they can actually recoup that from the receipts of the film before your private investors get paid back. So that is how they protect their loan. That's how they protect their money in all those different ways. And that is how you can go and borrow money for your film. Now, one piece of debt finance that is, I think, probably the most misunderstood of any kind of source of finance in the industry is gap financing. So gap financing is not simply, having 90% of your finance in place, having a 10% gap, and then finding a company that can lend that gap, right? That's not what it is. Gap financing is finance that's usually secured against the pre-sales of the film. So there needs to be deals that the sales agent has already put in place with distributors in order for a film finance company to come in and provide gap financing, because again, there's no real recourse for them. They're not taking security over your assets, your personal assets, and so that they need to have some sort of collateral. They need to have something that they can justify the reason that they're lending. And so that needs to be those distribution agreements that the sales agent has already lined up. And so this is why, especially when you're on your first film, on your first few films, it's not as likely for you to have pre-sales, especially during the financing stage. And so gap financing isn't something that really comes into it at that point. And gap financing also is something that not all film finance companies do. Only, a kind of subset of all the film finance companies actually do that. Now, another thing that's really important to keep in mind is that if you are out there Googling, looking for film finance companies, all of them will offer debt financing. That is their core business. They're not out there providing equity finance. They're not looking for projects to put money in as capital. They're looking for projects, or their core function is to provide debt financing. They're lending you money against tax incentives, distribution advances, and pre-sales. That's what they do. And really, there's very few, if any, that provide equity financing. And particularly at the lower budget, indie budget space. So really, anything under 10 million, there's very few, if any, companies that do that. So one thing to keep in mind when you're out there looking for finance is if you're just looking up film finance companies, all you're going to be getting really is debt financing. And that is still going to leave you with a big chunk of finance that you need to raise through equity. Because if a tax incentive is about 30% of your finance and a sales agent or a distributor is around 20% of your finance, that's 50%. So you still got 50% that you need to raise through equity. And those companies just don't do that. That's not what they do. They're not taking that type of risk. They're operating as debt lenders. So that's debt explained. The next one is equity. So equity is essentially capital that you're securing or receiving for your project. And in return, you're providing ownership of IP, shares in a company, or royalties. So basically an entitlement to future royalties. Now, the reason I've listed those three is that it actually is different depending on which country you're in. And so it could actually be any one of those things. Like, for example, in Australia, a private investor won't get copyright. They won't take shares in the company that's producing the film or the holding company. They will simply get an entitlement to profit, to future royalties. In the US, it's a bit different. They'll typically be issued shares in the company. So that's where it differs, and it is different country to country. But it's one of those things. And so capital is essentially money that's coming in at risk, right? They're really putting the money at risk. There's no promise for you to pay it back, right? If someone puts in equity into a project, they can't force you to pay that back because they're taking a risk. They're putting in that equity and they're hoping that the film performs. They're hoping that you're able to achieve what you're saying that you're going to achieve, and that they will reap the ultimate rewards of the risk that they're taking. And so in exchange for that risk that they're taking, private investors will usually be entitled to, or typical deal structure for a private investor in a film is for them to recoup at 120% of their investment in first position. So when money comes into the production company, they get paid first at 120%. And then they get an entitlement to the net profit, and usually the net profit is split in half, 50% to the investors and 50% to the production company. And so the private investors share in that 50%. And so that's typically how the deal is structured in the independent space. So with both of those, with both debt and equity, what's important to know is that neither of those entitle the people that are putting in the money, whether it's debt or equity, to any creative input. So if you're raising private equity, those investors don't suddenly have an entitlement to tell you what to do in terms of the creative of the film. And if anyone requires that as part of the deal, and they're a private investor, just walk away from the deal. It's not worth it, because you as the producers are the ones that have the creative and financial control of the project, and there's no reason that they would want or need that level of input. It's the same with the debt. So any of those debt financiers are not going to be taking any creative control or have creative input of the film. Now, behind the debt financiers is of course the distributors and the sales agents. So with your agreement with them, there may be some level of consultation that needs to take place. But typically if they're only putting in, a minority of the finance, like 10 to 20%, then they're not going to have creative control of the project, but they would want to be consulted at the various stages of production and see things like rough cuts, fine cuts. Obviously they'll be consulted, or they'll be creating the marketing material. So that's how all that works. So when you're making an independent film, one real benefit to making a film, especially over something like TV, is that you are able to retain creative control of the project. And in a lot of ways, you kind of have total control of the project. And that's because these financiers, they don't have that creative input that a streamer or a network or a broadcaster would have in TV. And the reason is, more than anything, is that in TV world, there's kind of like one party that's putting up the majority of the finance, whereas in film, you have all these different parties putting in, kind of minority stakes that all add up to the total finance. And so that allows you as a producer to really have control of the ship. So the last thing that I wanted to go over in this video is how to best combine debt and equity. And so really, in my experience, the best way to finance an independent film is using a combination of these things. So typically in the films that we finance, we will have a tax incentive in there, usually around 40%, because we'd be shooting it in Australia. Or if we're looking to take it overseas, we'd be trying to get into a state in the US or a country in Europe that has the equivalent, right? Because if we're going to move a shoot overseas, we need to be getting a decent chunk back. So that's 40% right there from a tax incentive. Again, 10 to 20% from distribution advances, and then the rest would be equity. And that equity would be made up of a combination of private equity, private investors, and it would be typically the director, the producers, and the post-production facility investing some of their fees back into the project. And so through those combinations or those sources of finance, we're able to finance a project. If we're accessing any soft money, so grants, typically they're only really making up around 5%, maybe at most 10% at the moment of any finance plan, but I would say it's 5% or nothing. So really, again, it's like the bulk is the tax incentive, and then the private equity and distribution advance. So it's like tax incentive, private equity, pretty equal, and then distribution advances on top of that. So that's how we do it. So with every film, we're just looking at those three things and how we're going to structure the finance plan in a way that makes it, I guess, the easiest to get that particular film financed. So that's it for this video. Bit in there. If you have any questions, make sure you drop them in the comments section below. Happy to answer any questions that you have about this topic. If there's any other topics that you want me to cover on these videos, please also let me know in the comments section below. Please like the video, share it, subscribe to this channel to be notified when we post a video. That's it for this week. I'll see you on the next one.